Hey, John here. I have tossed this idea around here for quite a while, just kind of debating in my own mind. Do I really want to go here or not? Well, here we go. I've got, if you read the description of this, it's like walking around with two stones in your boot. You know what I mean? It's just really, you can work, but kind of irritating. You can get along through life, but what is it with people who, I guess what gets me going here is some folks who I think should know better. I kind of get it. So what's this all about? Here we go. There's two parts of a cutter tooth that I hear people use the word, and one of the stones in my boot is the gullet. My word, the gullet. File that gullet out. You got to get the gullet out. Well, what they're talking about is not a gullet. Okay? That ought to get some people slamming the old keyboard right away. The term gullet comes from this area right here. Okay, it comes from a crosscut saw. And I get it, how this happened, that this part of the tooth, right, when you use a round file, this part of the tooth here, you can see the shape of it, and then you see the shape of a true gullet on a crosscut saw. It's logical to make that connection. But here's the deal. The gullet in a crosscut saw, that is where the chips are collecting as the saw is getting pulled through the log. All right? These little chips here, and you'll notice if you've run a crosscut saw, you don't make the long chips like a chainsaw does. They're all just little square chunks. That's because of the way a crosscut saw cuts fiber. Those little square chunks gather up in the gullet until the saw daylights out of the cut, it dumps out, and you start the process over. Okay, why am I kind of going off on this issue of this not being a gullet? The only reason I'm going here is if we call it a gullet and we teach that it's a gullet, then we're really not understanding how saw chain cuts wood. So let me show you something here. So here I have what's known as full comp chain. Comp just being the shortened version of full complement. It has all the teeth, okay? So if you haven't been into the chainsaw world a lot, most folks, that are running shorter bars, smaller saws, firewood, and so on, you don't really ask your saw shop for full comp chain. It's basically assumed. That's very, very common to run full comp chain. Okay, so where am I going with this gullet issue? When the saw tooth, and I should say teeth, because here's something that we want to keep in mind. It takes two teeth to actually create a chip that's going to come out of the curve, right? Because one tooth only cuts the fiber off on one side. The other side's still connected. It takes the tooth behind it, the opposite side, that cuts the fiber off the other end of that chip. Now we have a free floating chip that can, come out of the cut. Well, when the tooth's doing that, the chips do not collect in here. I mean, it's not logical that they do, okay? Because if this is where they collected, you wouldn't cut 6 inches through a log, and this would be all packed up with those chips. Where the chips go are under the tooth. They slip under the tooth. And if you haven't, go to my I got a YouTube on how saw teeth cut wood. And we talk about the chisel angle, this slope. That slope is important. That's what allows that chip to slip under the tooth. And then, going back to a real saw bar here, as those chips are going under the teeth, they're collecting in between the teeth. Remember, they're trapped in the kerf of the cut. So they're actually gathering, they're piling up, if you will, between the teeth. Piling up is what they did in a crosscut saw. They pile up in that gullet. So if we want to use the word gullet with saw chain, the gullet of saw chain is the gap between the teeth. That's where the chips collect. When the chainsaw, years ago, back in late 40s, 50s, they started figuring out how they could hook an engine onto a chain instead of pulling a misery whip. The first chains that came out, they called it an old drag chain. And it literally looked like just the cutter teeth of a crosscut saw. There was no gullet space. And they made it into a chain. And they found it would kind of grind through the log, but it really didn't work well. Basically, one of the reasons is it had no gullet space. So they started to, I have heard, my understanding is it was a Joe Cox out west, I think California, but don't quote me on that one. I know he's given credit for listening to a beetle eating a log, and he noticed that the mandrels on the beetle were kind of alternating back and forth in a curve shape, and you could hear that crunch, 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 crunch. And to his credit, he got the idea of coming up with basically our modern sawtooth. Okay, so they came up with a way to make this thing. They started making chain like what we call full complement. Okay, so again, there's the gap between the teeth. Didn't take long before they figured out this chainsaw thing's pretty slick. Well, out west, they're cutting big wood. And what they figured out was that if you use full comp chain on a longer bar, now I'm going up into, 20 inch plus, 30 inch, 40 inch, those long bars, when that chain is coming through the log, when it first gets into the log on the far end, that gullet space, gullet space here gets all packed up with chips fairly quickly. So they kind of scratched their head and said, hey, what if we maybe take some of those teeth out? And that's where they came up with the idea of what I run here. If you haven't seen it, okay, I'm hoping it comes across there. Hold it still quick. You'll notice that I've got a right and a left cutter, the same spacing as full comp, but then they add a link. So there's a right and a left and a space, a right and a left and a space. And in the chainsaw world, that's called semi-skip or half-skip chain. All they're doing is giving the chain a little more gullet space. It's literally like carving that cavity out a little bit so that the chips have some place to go and the teeth can stay up in the fresh wood. Take that concept another step, and you have full skip chain. So you've got an extra link between all of the teeth. There's roughly 40% fewer teeth on a loop of full skip compared to an equal length loop of full comp. So, and there's other places that we use that. It gets into cutting dirty wood, and I'm not going to go there for now. But the point is the gullet. So that's the connection. And I've been thinking about making this video, and I was going, well, if it's not the gullet, what should we call it? We got to give it a name, right? Everybody talks about it. And I thought, well, a lot of times, so that we don't get confused in the English language, we go to Latin, and we come up with a Latin name for something, like our trees, right? We got hard maple and rock maple, it's the same tree. But if you call it Acer saccharum, I know what that is, right? That Latin name. So I thought, Maybe we should call this bottom of the Okay, that's they always, you know how when they do the tree thing, they go to Acer Saccharum. I think it's the genus and the species, something like that, right? So there's two names, like Pinus strobus, white pine. Okay, I think that is. I hope I got that right. So this is the bottom of the toothia. So I think that would be a good Latin name to call this, and then we'd all understand what it is. It's the bottom of the toothia. It's not a gullet. All right, while we're on the topic, we got another little stone in the boot, right? And this one, I'm going to do quick, and I'm going to throw it in here, really just for the reason that the name that got stuck to it, that's very common, got stuck to it because of the crosscut saw, okay? And what I'm talking about, of course, you're ahead of me, and it's the raker, okay? And there's a lot of names for it. I grew up calling it a raker, you know, whatever we want to call it, that's fine. My point here is, let's understand how that name got stuck to it. When the crosscut, okay, if you understand how crosscuts work, these sharp pointed teeth, okay, these guys here, if I can't get it good on the video, but they're sharpened alternately, this way, and then the next one is this way, okay? Those sharp pointed teeth are doing what the side of the tooth does. That's cutting the fiber off of that chip. The raker, that is a raker. These are the cutters. This is the raker. And can you see where it was just logical that they made that connection where they could see that these are the sharp edges that are cutting. This is in front of the cutter, so this must be a raker. That's where that comes from. Most importantly, of course, we understand what it is, how it works, and all that. That's a different video. I've got a couple videos on that, and you've probably seen them all. Okay, there's a lot of them out there. But here's my point, is that you call it a raker, and you really don't understand how the tooth works, you can be misled into this is raking something. It doesn't rake anything, okay? I've often thought over the years, the name that would have been really slick, that could have been tagged to this part of a cutter tooth, is if it was called a limiter, right? That word is much more descriptive of what it actually does. Right now you always use this here as an example of a piece of wood, and you see that limiter doing its job. If that wasn't there, then when that tooth hooked into that fiber, the tooth would simply, right, it would just sink right in, and you know, it wouldn't work. It would just jam the chain. So they, back in whenever they made this thing, right, they came up with that idea of a limiter. And that's what it's doing. It's limiting the depth of the tooth into the wood. And, you know, we're only talking the thickness of a business card there. It's just a little bit. At 40 miles an hour, we can cut some wood. Okay? So, I got that off my chest, as they say. I thought of it for a long time, and I watched the videos of, file that gullet out, gotta get that gullet out, right? Now, does that have to be filed out? Yes. Okay, if you're using a round file, you've got to get this, and it's basically what we're doing there. And when we say we got to file that gullet out, what we're saying is we got to get that metal out of the way so that the file stays in its proper height in the tooth. The file running up too high, if this metal starts to, if you're not taking that out, the file kind of runs higher and higher and higher. You stand your side plate angle up, you're blunting your chisel angle, and you just start making more of sawdust and chips. So does it have to be filed out? Yes. But let's understand how this thing works. It's not a gullet. It's the gap between the teeth. It's gullet on a saw chain. Look forward to your comments. Take care, guys.